Hello and welcome to the Capitol Report on NTD Television. I'm R-S.C. Senator Tim Scott, latest to join the crowded GOP primary field for the U.S. presidency. He formally announced the news in his hometown today and was met with a pleasant reaction from his opponent, former President Trump. More on this from NTD's Melina Weiskup, reporting from South Carolina.
We're here in the gym of a small university in North Charleston, South Carolina, where 57-year-old Tim Scott officially announced his bid for the White House. He took a very personable approach today, showing up on stage in a long-sleeve blue button-down shirt. It seems this is one of the themes that he's trying to create for this campaign, a very personable atmosphere. He honed in on his childhood. He says that this is the land of opportunity and specifically denounced accusations that America is a racist country. Here's a few remarks from the senator.
I'm living proof that America is the land of opportunity and not a land of oppression. I choose freedom and hope and opportunity.
And this optimistic tone that he's taken has already seemed to have resonated in the hearts of many South Carolina voters. The ones we spoke to, at least outside, who are lining up at 8:30 a.m. this morning, all said the same thing. I specifically asked what they feel stands out about Senator Scott versus other candidates such as Nikki Haley or President Trump, for example. Here's what the voters told us.
He really brings that message of hope, and he also works across the aisle. He's in Washington right now working for all of our best interest.
I think we need somebody in the field who's going to look forward, who's going to lay out a positive vision, not look backwards with all the divisiveness we've been through in the past 4 to 6 years.
And Senator Scott does have some work to do to emerge from this crowded GOP primary, including those popular names, especially here in the state of South Carolina. Nikki Haley is a very popular name since she did serve formerly as governor. And former President Trump, of course, is very popular across the nation with Republican voters. Trump actually commented on Scott's announcement today, saying good luck to Senator Tim Scott in entering the Republican presidential primary race. And Tim is a big step from Ron DeSantis, who is totally unelectable. Now, a top issue that Senator Scott pointed out was that the first action he would take upon taking the White House, if he does get elected, is immigration. And this comes at a time when President Biden's handling of immigration is under the microscope. A recent AP poll shows that just 31% of Americans approve of Biden's immigration policies so far. Now, Senator Scott has already received some support from his colleagues on Capitol Hill. Specifically, Republican Whip Senator John Thune has endorsed him officially. This is just the beginning of a long campaign where Scott will be vying to emerge from a crowded GOP primary, and his hopes are to challenge that Democrat nominee. Reporting in North Charleston, South Carolina, Melina Weiskup, NTD News.
And turning now to the debt ceiling negotiations. House Speaker Kevin McCarthy today met with President Biden at the White House for the third time this month. The goal remains to reach an agreement on how to increase the nation's borrowing limit to avoid a default. To break down the situation, we had a chance to speak with John Tamney, a director at FreedomWorks. Here's a look. John Tamney, the director of Center for Economic Freedom at FreedomWorks. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So we continue to see this stalemate between the White House and the House Speaker. Could you tell us what's the likelihood now, in your opinion, of us seeing an actual national default, given the latest developments?
There's no likelihood. It's not going to happen in the traditional sense. To be clear, we've defaulted lots of times. If you go back to 1933, that was our first default when FDR changed the value of the dollar, thus vitiating all treasuries that were extant at that time. The dollar's value is shrunken, and so we've shrunken the value of the dollar numerous times since, and that is a default on our debt. In terms of this, how you know there's not going to be a debt default is all the debt that the U.S. already has. That is a signal that this is going to be resolved, and it's going to be resolved as it always does. They'll raise the debt ceiling, and they'll raise the debt ceiling because both Democrats and Republicans have a vested interest in keeping the federal government funded and growing.
And we see that President Biden this past weekend basically again floated this idea of using the 14th Amendment to unilaterally raise the debt ceiling without congressional authorization. What do you think about that possible approach?
He doesn't have the power to do that. The Constitution's pretty clear that Congress controls the power of the purse, but this is good politics. His base does not want to see him compromise. The Republican base doesn't want to see Kevin McCarthy compromise, and that's what we're seeing right now. Anyone with a clue, anyone with a pulse knows that this will be resolved. And how you know this is markets are very calm right now. The only question is when it's going to be resolved. And so you're going to see right now is both sides, Kevin McCarthy feeding a Republican flock, Joe Biden feeding a ravenous Democratic flock. They're going to feed them these little things, this rhetoric, this brinksmanship. But everyone knows what's going to happen. The U.S. will pay its bills as it always does.
And we also see that U.S. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen this Sunday doubled down on the June 1st assessment of a possible default, calling it a hard deadline. Do you think that's the case?
No, of course it's not the case. Janet Yellen is a walking, talking contrarian indicator. Whatever she says is going to happen, just bet the opposite and you'll make a lot of money. There's no way of knowing that. Furthermore, let's assume for fun that no resolution is made by June 1st. Does anyone think that the U.S. will stop paying its bills? Or does anyone think that suddenly various federal entities will have no money? No one could seriously think that. I mean, if you're any federal entity, you could hand out IOUs around the country that anyone would take. That once you started creating these IOUs, there would be a liquid market for them. And the reason for that is that the U.S. Treasury takes in every single day enormous sums of money from the most productive people on earth. And so everyone knows this is going to be resolved. And so even if there are a few days or even weeks where we are, quote, in technical default, you're not going to see the world end. And you're not going to see the world end because everyone knows ultimately the U.S. is going to pay its bills. It's good for those bills.
You said that ultimately we will avoid a default, but what if we reach that point even just in a technical sense? How do you think the markets will react?
Well, if we're ever to come to the point where actually we could not pay our bills, there probably would be a catastrophic reaction. But let's be clear, that catastrophe would already be a well-known thing, and markets would have priced it actually many years ago. And you would have seen it many years ago in terms of interest rates on Treasury debt skyrocketing to reflect the reduced ability of the U.S. being able to pay its debt. And what that should tell you is that the surest sign we're not going to default is the fact that we have an ongoing, every couple of years, debt ceiling fight. Countries that actually have to default, like Argentina, that quite literally can't pay their bills, they don't get to borrow in the first place. As in markets work, and markets are working here. The reality is that we're having a debt ceiling fight simply because if the U.S. Treasury wanted to, if it weren't restrained by Congress, it could raise exponentially more debt. And it could do that because it's a known quantity that Treasury is backed by the most productive people on earth. And so, yeah, there could be a default. There could come a time where the U.S. can't pay its bills. But trust me, once that we reach that point, there will be no debt ceiling fights in the first place.
John Tamny, the director of Center for Economic Freedom at FreedomWorks. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Only half of Americans say they're sure that God exists. Meanwhile, the number of Americans who never go to church is at a record high. That's according to a newly released annual study. Since the 80s, the National Opinion Research Center at the University of Chicago has been publishing the General Social Survey. This year's report found that just under half of Americans say they have no doubts about the existence of God. This corresponds with an increase in people who do not believe in God at all and those who believe in a higher power of some kind. Findings also show that over a third of all Americans never go to church. That's the highest record since the question was first asked in 1972. But the study also found that almost 3/4 of Americans still believe in life after death. Meanwhile, another study published this month found that 27% of Americans say they're not religious. And that's up from only 19% in 2012.
Thank you for watching the Capitol Report. If you want to see our full broadcast, check us out at epochtv.com.